Hello and welcome to our chapter on organic compounds. We are going to take a big chunk out of the course material because organic chemistry is one of the portions of this textbook. However, it will be important for our use in the next parts where we talk about biological chemistry, biochemistry, because organic chemistry is the basis of all biological functions and reactions. First, you are going to learn about the representation and interpretation of the structures of organic compounds. Then you are going to learn about alkanes. These are the simplest organic compounds. And then you are going to see different classes of organic compounds differentiated by the functional groups they contain. After that, you are going to learn how to name simple alkanes. And at last, we're going to talk about the concept of isomerism. Originally, the word organic covered substances that were obtained from living things. But later on, with the advent of modern chemistry, organic chemistry now means the compounds of carbon, their properties and behavior. This includes parts of living things such as proteins, DNA, the food that you eat, the medicines that we use, polymers that we use in our daily lives. For example, ibuprofen is a pharmaceutical and it is an organic compound. The styrofoam cup that you are using to drink something hot to not burn your hands is a polymer, an organic substance. Your blood carries oxygen using iron. Iron sits in the middle of a large molecule called the heme molecule, for which make the hemoglobin. And the heme molecule, as you see, is a rather complex organic compound. Organic chemistry is one of the biggest branches of chemistry. So why is it so big? Carbon has unique properties. It makes 4 bonds, as we have discussed earlier, and it can achieve these 4 bonds by having different arrangement of single bonds, double bonds, or triple bonds. This is the only element that can form, currently known, more than 50 million compounds. It can form long chains, it can form rings, it's very diverse. We are going to touch only a small portion of organic chemistry in this chapter. Let's first start by discussing the structures of organic compounds and how we can represent them. The molecular formula gives you the least amount of information. It tells you what kind of atoms there is and the relative numbers of them. The more information is given in the Lewis structure. It tells us which atom is bonded to which atom and by how many and what kind of bonds. As expected, hydrogen atoms are making 1 bond each, and carbon atoms are making 4 bonds each. Each carbon is bonded to each other, forming a backbone, and then carries enough hydrogen atoms to make up to 4 bonds. Lewis structure gives us the most information. You can condense the Lewis structure, we call it the condensed structure actually, into each carbon atom and whatever bonded to it written on the right side of it. So this CH3 indicates this CH3. The CH2 indicates this CH2. You can simplify Lewis structures. We call them skeletal structures. Each line represents a bond, and at the end of each line, on each end, there is a carbon atom. So in this given skeletal structure for propane, there are 1, 2, 3 carbon atoms. The carbon atoms are not shown actually, but in this picture, they are represented so that you can see where they are. They're at the ends of each line and each vertex. Let's discuss condensed structures in more detail. Using propane as an example, the first carbon on your left contains 3 hydrogens. Therefore, in the condensed structure, you write it as a CH3. Remember, everything that the carbon has must be written to the right of it. The second carbon contains 2 hydrogen atoms. Therefore, it's a CH2 in the condensed structure. Likewise, the carbon on the right, the terminal carbon atom, contains 3 hydrogens, therefore CH3. What if you have a functional group on the carbon? Here we have an OH group. How would you show it? The first carbon is still the same. It's a CH3, but the second carbon contains the hydrogen and the OH group. You need to show both of them, CH and then OH in parentheses, to show that OH is a group of its own attached to the carbon. And the last carbon is, again, a CH3. If that OH was on the terminal carbon, at the end carbon, then you would have to write CH3, CH2 for the first 2 carbons, and then for the terminal last carbon, CH2, and it contains the OH group. If you have a branched molecule such as this, a branch is a split from the main chain. The main chain contains 4 carbons, but from this carbon, there's a split. It's branching. So this is a branched compound. You can show the attachment to the branching point by a bond and write its condensed formula. Or you can show the condensed structure as CH3, CH2, and then CH up to the 3rd carbon. CH3, CH2, CH. And what's attached to that carbon is 2 CH3 groups, one here and one here. 2 CH3 groups. You can show them in parentheses. This means that these 2 CH3 groups are on this carbon. The parentheses indicates that it is on that last carbon. Now let's learn about skeletal structures. I find them personally easier to draw because there are less things to write down. These structures show only bonds. The carbon-hydrogen bonds are not shown. They're implied. It only shows carbon-carbon bonds or carbon to other atom bonds, but not to hydrogen. If there are other elements bonded to carbon, such as oxygen, nitrogen, sulfur, you have to show these atoms using their symbol at the end of the bond. If these atoms have hydrogens themselves, those hydrogens are shown also. And in skeletal structures, lone pairs are not shown. For example, in ethanol, we have 1, 2 carbon atoms, and to the second carbon, we have an oxygen, and to that a hydrogen attached. Each bond between carbons, carbon and the oxygen, oxygen and the hydrogen, is a single bond. In the case of cyclohexene, we have a cyclic structure made up of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 carbon atoms, and between 2 of the carbon atoms, there is a double bond. So the double bond is shown by 2 dashes, 2 lines connecting the atoms. In the case of acetic acid, which is found in vinegar, we have a carbon atom here, a carbon atom here. They're not shown, but this carbon is double bonded to an oxygen, single bonded to another oxygen, which is in turn bonded to a hydrogen. In vinyl chloride, which is used to make polyvinyl chloride, PVC pipes, etc., we have one carbon here double bonded to another carbon, which is single bonded to a chlorine. As you can see, hydrogen atoms on the carbons are not shown, they are implied. But how many hydrogen atoms is there for each carbon? Let's take this carbon for an example. It is currently shown to make one bond. How many atoms does a carbon atom need to make? 4. If 1 is shown here, there has to be 3 other bonds to 3 hydrogen atoms. Therefore, this carbon here has 3 hydrogen atoms on it. How about this carbon? It's shown to make 1, 2, 3, 4 bonds. Therefore, it has 4 bonds already. This carbon does not have any hydrogen atoms on it. Likewise, this carbon atom here has 2 bonds, so it needs 2 more, so it has 2 hydrogens. This carbon here has 1, 2, 3 bonds. It needs 1 more, so it has 1 hydrogen attached to it. Remember, carbon has to make 4 bonds. So by counting the number of bonds shown in a skeletal structure and filling the rest by hydrogen atoms to make 4 bonds, you can determine the number of hydrogen atoms on each carbon. For example, this carbon atom is shown to make 1 bond. It needs 3 more. Those are filled by 3 hydrogen atoms. For example, this carbon atom is shown to make 1, 2, 3 bonds. It needs 1 more bond, therefore 1 hydrogen. So you can fill all the carbon atoms with enough hydrogen atoms to make them make all 4 bonds. And then you count the number of hydrogen atoms by adding them up. You also count the carbon atoms. At the end of each line, there's a carbon atom. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 carbon atoms. And we have 1 oxygen atom. Now you can write the molecular formula: 10 carbon atoms, 14 hydrogen atoms, and 1 oxygen atom. Now pause and determine the molecular formula of the shown skeletal structures. Let's see how we can convert a given Lewis or condensed structure to a skeletal structure. The first thing you need to do is to count the number of carbon atoms in the longest continuous chain. Here we have 1, 2, 3 carbons. Those carbons are shown by 2 lines that connects them. So there are 1, 2 bonds connecting 3 carbons. Those are shown by 1, 2, 3 points and 1, 2 lines, meaning 2 bonds. Remember, at the end of each line, there's a carbon atom. Carbon 1, carbon 2, carbon 3. 1, 2, 3. And in the Lewis structure, the second carbon contains an OH. So attach that OH to the second carbon to get the skeletal structure. What if the OH is on the terminal carbon, meaning the carbon at the end? The beginning carbon is also a terminal carbon. It means at the end of the molecule. Again, this contains 1, 2, 3 carbon atoms. So the skeletal structure showing the carbon atoms will have 1, 2, 3 carbon atoms. And then the third carbon has an OH on it, and that is shown by this bond. So there's a carbon here, there's a carbon here, there's a carbon here. There's an oxygen here, shown by the symbol O. You can show the hydrogen directly next to oxygen or by a bond and then the symbol for H. They both would be correct. Now pause and convert these given structures to skeletal structures. Make sure you draw your answer on paper and then check your work.